What is philosophy to you, Chris?
It's a moving target, Tim. I mean, I thought I knew, 10 years ago and 5 years ago, and I think it's meant different things to me at different times. I mean, giving some kind of rote definition seems, just like a valueless thing to do. So maybe what I can tell you is what it means to me now at this precise moment, which is a much more authentic answer than to try and define it on its own terms. And what it is for me now, very powerfully, is simply the revelation of ignorance. And I don't know if it's because I'm slipping sideways into some kind of Greek skepticism or what. But so, okay, maybe two things. One is the revelation of ignorance, and on a good day, that means learned ignorance, the kind that Augustine talked about and Nicholas of Cusa talked about, where ignorance becomes a way to index attention back to the well, let's say to redirect the eye of attention back to the negative presence of truth. And by the negative presence of truth, I mean everything that is by virtue of everything that is not here and now. And then related to that is I still recourse to the Delphic maxim, right? To know thyself. And the realization of ignorance and the observance of that maxim are inseparable to me now, because I think I've reached a point where this is a personal disclosure rather than a philosophical one, but perhaps they're tied together. That so much of we are so numinously mysterious to ourselves, and most of us know that before we know that. We know it prospectively. We know it because we acquire vicarious knowledge that gives us testimony to that fact in advance of the experience. But I think that undergoing the experience of proper self-negation or self-disillusionment is such a comprehensively humbling experience that it seems to affirm some kind of lately, Tim, I'm gonna sidelong a little bit here, because something is happening now that I had a feeling would happen, and I want to explain to you what it is. I find myself recently, it's costing me great effort to have these kinds of conversations right now, because I find that whatever language I can adduce to this seems only to diminish it. And that's not some kind of romantic valorization of silence or the ineffable or anything like that. I don't mean that for effect. I really don't. But philosophy to me right now is silence. And for whatever reason, at this particular point in time, at this juncture, whether because of the material circumstances that we've been lamenting about, or because of just happening upon a certain moment, I find it very, very, very difficult to to exposit, to hold, let alone to exposit, any positive belief about what philosophy is, whether to me or on its own merit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because I'm renegotiating my relationship with it. And I'm renegotiating the imperative of that relationship and what it calls forth from me and what it seems to require of me. Because, you know, the world is full of people who can speak like with incredible erudition about this, and there's really no need for me to do it because they do it better anyway. And so for me, the meaning of philosophy, then I'm not trying to, you know, this is not an act of subversion, Tim. I'm really happy to be talking to you. I trust you know that. It's not an act of subversion. It's simply like a very honest reflection of the fact that somehow any explanation I could bring to bear in response to the question would be nothing as compared to the question itself. And there is something about the ignorance of the silence, the waiting ignorance, the expectant ignorance of the silence, that is an inexpressible, not a comfort necessarily, but it is the only thing that actually seems to be life affirming. Mm-hmm. When set against the din of 1,000 possible explanations. You know, Socrates has this line in one of the dialogues, I think it's the Cratylus, where he says, you're talking about naming and the meaning of names. And he says, the name is an instrument that divides being. And I feel very beset by divided being. I seem to experience the world right now as a vivisection of endless divisions, endless alternatives, endless competing systems and competing frames of reference that account for what is true and what is meaningful. It's one of the reasons I tend to abstain from metaphysical positions, simply because I find that I can alternatively find beauty in many of them, and it seems to be an aesthetic sensibility that directs my philosophical appetites and attention rather than a logical one. There's a quote by a writer named Jack Lindsay, Australian, incidentally. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jack Lindsay. He was sort of a 20th, wrote through the 20th century, and he was sort of a continentalist and took a great interest in Nietzsche and Nietzsche's abyssal experience with nihilism and nothingness. And when setting himself in Nietzsche's position, beholding the dark, he said, you know, this is an abyss that cannot be crossed by any thread of logic, but by the wings of aesthetic intuition alone, the logic of which is the symmetry of those wings curving into flight. And when I read that, I feel an incredibly powerful affinity with it, because the silence of the spontaneously lived moment of proper attention eclipses any exposition that I could bring to bear on myself, and certainly that I could share with anyone else. And so at this moment, philosophy to me is the air that rushes through the wings of that aesthetic intuition as it bears its way and inclines itself to a greater vantage to observe its own shadow on the face of the world, and with some hope and some possibility, apprehends some fraction more of what it is.
Thank you for listening. And if you enjoy these podcasts, please consider sharing them or leaving a review, and perhaps also to consider supporting it on patreon.com/voicecraft. It will help sustain the podcast, build the network, and make possible more community events and educational resources.